October 15, 1936, 10:45 p.m. The Cotton Club, 644 Lenox Avenue. The music stopped. Duke Ellington's band didn't just fade out. They froze, instruments halfway to their lips, as if the air in the room had suddenly turned to glass. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a man's ribs. Two men sat at a small round table in the center of the dance floor, surrounded by 300 of the city's most dangerous people. On one side sat Charles Lucky Luciano, the architect of modern organized crime, flanked by four Sicilians whose coats bulged with Thompson submachine guns. On the other side sat Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, alone. Between them rested a chessboard, but the pieces weren't made of wood or ivory. They were bullets. .45 caliber rounds for black, 38 specials for white. Check, Luciano said, sliding a silver-cased lighter forward, and made in two moves. You lose the game, Bumpy. You lose the avenue. You lose your life. The stakes on the table were $100,000 in cash and total control of the Harlem numbers racket. But the real stake was the precarious peace between the Italian five families and the black underworld. Bumpy Johnson looked at the board. He looked at the gunman. He didn't sweat. He reached into his pocket, not for a weapon, but for a single, terrifying object that would change the history of New York crime in 10 seconds. 3 weeks earlier, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was already a legend on 125th Street, but in 1936, he was fighting a war on two fronts. As the enforcer for Madame Stephanie Sneed Claire, the queen of policy, Bumpy stood as the lone barrier between Harlem's independent wealth and the voracious appetite of the Italian mob. He wasn't just a thug, he was a warrior pied who carried a switchblade in one pocket and a book of philosophy in the other. He controlled the streets because he understood the people, and he defended them with a ferocity that made hardened killers cross the street to avoid him. The historical moment was volatile. Prohibition had ended 3 years prior, drying up the mob's biggest revenue stream. The Italians, led by the newly formed commission, were desperate for cash. They looked uptown and saw the numbers game, a penny lottery played by thousands of Harlem residents, generating millions of dollars annually. It was a gold mine left unguarded, or so they thought. The Dutch Schultz era was ending violently, and a power vacuum was opening up. The tension was racial, economic, and territorial. The Italians viewed Harlem as a colony to be conquered. They didn't want partnership. They wanted subjugation. They began beating runners, smashing storefronts, and firebombing the collection spots. Madame St. Clair was stubborn, but she was losing ground. Bumpy knew that brute force alone wouldn't win this war. He needed a victory that wasn't written in blood, but in humiliation. He needed to prove that a black man from Harlem could outthink the smartest gangster in America. Charles Lucky Luciano was not a man to be trifled with. By 1936, he had reorganized the chaotic Italian gangs into a corporate structure known as the Commission. He was the chairman of the board. He had eliminated the old mustache pates, Maranzano, and Masseria with cold, calculating efficiency. He didn't scream, he whispered. And when he whispered, people died. Luciano wanted the Harlem numbers, all of it. He estimated the rackets were worth $20,000 a week in pure profit. To him, Bumpy Johnson was an annoyance, a wild card that needed to be removed from the deck. Luciano believed that black criminals were disorganized and intellectually inferior. He didn't respect Bumpy. He tolerated him only until he could crush him. He was dangerous because he wielded the power of the state and the street simultaneously. He had judges in his pocket and hitmen like Bugsy Siegel on his payroll. His resources were limitless. He had just successfully absorbed the Jewish gangs into his syndicate. The direct threat came in the form of the public challenge. Luciano sent a messenger to the Renaissance ballroom with a note for Bumpy. It wasn't a declaration of war, but something more insulting, an invitation to a gentleman's game at the Cotton Club. If Bumpy won, the Italians would retreat for 6 months. If Luciano won, Bumpy would surrender Madame St. Clair's entire book of business. It was a trap wrapped in arrogance. October 15th, 1936, 10:15 p.m. The setup was theatrical. Luciano chose the Cotton Club because it was white-owned, a place where black people were the entertainers, not the patrons. By forcing Bumpy to meet him there, he was asserting dominance before the first pawn moved. He surrounded the club with NYPD officers on his payroll, ensuring Bumpy couldn't bring his own army. The sensory details inside the club were overwhelming. The air smelled of expensive cigars, French perfume, and the faint, metallic tang of fear. The lighting was dim, smoky, casting long shadows across the white linen tablecloths. Crystal glasses clinking, ting, ting, against the low hum of conversation. When Bumpy entered, the room went quiet. He wore a tuxedo that fit him like armor. He walked with his signature limp, the tap-step drag rhythm echoing on the hardwood floor. He sat down. "You're late," Luciano said, smoothing his silk tie. His eyes were like sharks, skin flat and gray. "Traffic on Lenox is murder," Bumpy replied, his voice calm, low, a rumble of thunder in a valley. They began to play. The pieces, the bullets clacked against the board. At 10:22 p.m., Luciano moved his knight, a .38 shell casing. At 10:38 shell casing. At 10:28 p.m., Bumpy countered with a bishop, a .35 slug. The game was fast, aggressive. Luciano played like he ran the city bold, sweeping moves designed to intimidate. He took Bumpy's pieces with a smirk, lining the captured bullets up like a firing squad. "You play like you fight, Johnson," Luciano sneered at 10:35 p.m. "Reactive. Emotional." "I play the board I see," Bumpy said, moving a rook. By 10:40 p.m., Bumpy was in trouble. His defenses were crumbling. Luciano had him pinned in the corner. The crowd, sensing blood, leaned in. The mob soldiers tightened their grip on their weapons. The tension was a wire pulled to the breaking point. At 10:44 p.m., Luciano made his move. He slammed his Queen of 50 caliber round onto the center of the board. "Check," he said, "and mate in two." "It's over." The silence returned. The band stopped. The room held its breath. Bumpy stared at the board. He looked trapped. He looked finished. What Luciano didn't know was that Bumpy Johnson had spent the last 3 nights studying Luciano's chess games, not on a board but in life. Bumpy knew Luciano was arrogant. He knew Luciano couldn't resist the flashy kill. Bumpy reached into his tuxedo pocket. The mob soldiers tensed, fingers twitching on triggers. He didn't pull a gun. He pulled out a piece of paper. It was a receipt. 3 days earlier, October 12th, Bumpy had realized he couldn't beat Luciano with force. The Italians had too many guns. So, Bumpy used the one thing Luciano loved more than power, his freedom. Bumpy had met with a young, ambitious prosecutor named Thomas E. Dewey. He didn't snitch. He didn't give up names. He simply gave Dewey a map of the brothels Luciano ran under a shell corporation. The twist, the chess game, wasn't on the table. It was the room itself. While Luciano was focused on the bullets on the board, Bumpy's men hadn't been idle. They hadn't come to the club. They had gone to the precinct. Bumpy unfolded the paper and placed it gently on top of Luciano's queen. "I don't need to move my king," Bumpy said softly, "because I just took your castle." He pointed to the entrance. The doors burst open, but it wasn't Bumpy's men. It was Thomas E. Dewey. Behind him were 20 state troopers, not NYPD. State troopers Luciano didn't own. "Charles Luciano," Dewey announced, his voice cutting through the smoke. "You are under arrest for compulsory prostitution." Bumpy stood up. He picked up the .50 caliber bullet Luciano's queen. He tossed it in the air and caught it. "You focused on the pawns, Lucky," Bumpy whispered, leaning in close. "You forgot that the king has to watch his own back." October 15th, 1936, 10:55 p.m. The chaos was immediate. Tables overturned, glass shattered. The Sicilians reached for their guns, but saw the shotguns of the state troopers leveled at their chests. They froze. Luciano stood up, his face a mask of pure shock. For the first time in his life, the man who engineered the syndicate looked outplayed. As the handcuffs clicked onto Luciano's wrists, Snicky looked back at the table. Bumpy was already walking away. He didn't run, he strolled. The ripple effects were seismic. Luciano's arrest that night led to the famous trial that eventually sent him to prison for 30 to 50 years. The head of the snake had been cut off, not by a bullet, but by a maneuver. The 5 families were thrown into disarray. The pressure on Harlem vanished overnight. The numbers war ended because the generals were too busy trying to save themselves from Dewey's crusade. Bumpy walked out onto Lenox Avenue. The cold air hit his face. He lit a cigarette. Madame St. Clair was waiting in a car around the corner. "Did you win?" she asked. "We drew," Bumpy said, exhaling a plume of smoke. "But he's not going to be playing again for a very long time." His legend was cemented that night. He wasn't just the man who would cut you, he was the man who could outthink the devil himself. He became the undisputed godfather of Harlem, a title he would hold until his death. This confrontation matters because it represents the only time a Harlem crime figure successfully utilized the legal system as a weapon against the Italian Mafia without becoming an informant. Bumpy weaponized the ambitions of Thomas Dewey to remove a threat he couldn't kill. It reveals Bumpy's true genius. While other gangsters like Dutch Schultz wanted to kill Dewey, a move that got Schultz killed, Bumpy saw Dewey as a chess piece. He understood that in the game of power, your enemy's enemy is your rook. The universal lesson is timeless. If you can't win the game, change the board. Luciano was playing checkers with bullets. Bumpy was playing 4D chess with the legal system. He proved that the most dangerous weapon isn't the one in your holster, but the one between your ears. If this story showed you why Bumpy Johnson was the true king of New York, hit that subscribe button. We're dropping new history every week. Drop a like if you respect the hustle, and tell me in the comments, was Bumpy wrong for using the cops to take out Luciano? Next week we cover the time Bumpy Johnson escaped a hit squad by hiding in a coffin. You don't want to miss it.